Long before the Strait of Hormuz, before the Suez Canal, there was another gap. A half-mile wide channel of water running through a single city, known across history as Byzantium, then Constantinople, and today, Istanbul. It was here that the world learned its first great lesson about trade, power, and control. Here's the uncomfortable truth this city reveals. Empires have always told themselves that power comes from conquest, from armies, from ideology, from producing more than your rivals. Constantinople proves something else entirely. The deepest form of power was never about owning territory. It was about controlling movement. Whoever controls what moves, goods, money, ideas, ships, or information, quietly controls everyone who depends on that movement continuing. That is the operating system running underneath civilization itself. Constantinople didn't invent it. It was simply the place where the world first saw it running at full scale. Every civilization tells its history as a story of building, cities, armies, monuments, ideas. But there's a quieter story hiding underneath all of it, a story about controlling the flow between places, rather than the places themselves. Constantinople is where that quieter story becomes impossible to ignore. For over 1,000 years, one city sat on the only water passage between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, and in doing so, discovered a principle that every dominant power since has rediscovered in a new form. Territory can be conquered, but movement can be owned. This documentary isn't really about Constantinople. It's about the invisible rule the city exposed, a rule that has since reappeared in Venice's ledgers, in Britain's shipping lanes, in Wall Street's cables, in Singapore's ports, and in the servers that route today's global internet traffic. The names keep changing. The rule does not. Constantinople wasn't built because of brilliant planning. It was built on top of a fact of geography. Every route connecting Central Asia, the Caucasus, and the Black Sea coast to the markets of Europe had to pass through one narrow channel, with no alternative and no detour. This is the first version of an idea that would repeat itself for the next 2,000 years. A city doesn't need to be the strongest power on Earth. It only needs to sit at the one point everyone else has no choice but to pass through. Trade moved through it. Silk from China, grain from Egypt, furs from the Russian steppe, spices from India. None of it was made in the city. All of it had to move through the city. And that distinction between producing wealth and controlling the movement of wealth is the first upgrade in the operating system this documentary is tracing. 2,000 years later, Singapore, Dubai, and the Panama Canal Authority run on the exact same logic. Make yourself unavoidable, and the world will pay you simply to pass. Once you control movement, you don't need to make anything. You just need to charge for passage. Byzantine emperors built one of the ancient world's most advanced customs systems, taxing every cargo that crossed their waters. This is where the operating system upgrades again. Taxing the movement of wealth, rather than producing wealth directly, becomes its own form of empire. Centuries later, Venice would refine this into modern banking and maritime insurance. Today, the same logic runs invisibly through systems most people never think of as descendants of Constantinople's customs house. Visa and MasterCard don't manufacture anything. They control the movement of money between banks and take a toll on every transaction. Apple doesn't need to build every app on Earth. It controls the movement of software onto 1 billion devices and charges accordingly. Amazon Web Services doesn't create the world's data.
It controls the routes that data has to travel through to reach people. Shopify doesn't create the products, but charges commissions on the products sold on its platform. Different technology, same principle Constantinople discovered with a customs officer and a rope across the harbor.
Controlling that much wealth required something rulers alone could never provide: a system that could outlast them. Known across history as Byzantium, then Constantinople, and today Istanbul, this city has worn different names, but its strategic importance has never changed. The city built one of history's first professional bureaucracies, and a currency so trusted it remained the standard for international trade across 3 continents for 700 years, even as emperors above it were overthrown, assassinated, and replaced at an almost constant rate.
This reveals the next layer of the operating system. Movement doesn't only apply to ships and coins. It applies to institutions, the systems that let power move from one ruler to the next without the machine underneath collapsing. Central banks today are built the same way, designed specifically so a change in government doesn't interrupt the currency, the markets, or the courts running beneath it. Constantinople didn't invent bureaucracy. It proved that a system built to survive its rulers could outlast the empire itself, and every stable modern state is still running that same proof.
For centuries, walls protected what geography had given. Constantinople. The Theodosian walls, built to defend Constantinople, held off Arab armies, Slavic coalitions, and crusader forces for nearly 1,000 years. But in 1453, Ottoman cannons broke through fortifications that had never fallen. And this is the moment the story stops being about one city and becomes about the entire modern world. Because when control of that channel changed hands, it wasn't just a flag being replaced. It was control of the movement itself being transferred to a new operator who immediately closed the terms Europe had relied on for centuries. Punishing new tariffs, restricted access to Asian goods, a continent suddenly locked out of the very movement it had built its economies around.
For centuries, Europe's lifeline to the riches of Asia depended on routes that converged through Constantinople. But those routes were never secure. Relentless wars, sieges, shifting empires, and mounting political pressure turned the city into a persistent bottleneck, making access to Eastern trade increasingly uncertain and costly. Europe's search for new routes was not born from a single conquest. It was the culmination of generations of instability centered on Constantinople.
Denied a reliable passage through the crossroads it had depended on for centuries, Europe did not accept a smaller world. It looked beyond the familiar map, seeking a way around the problem entirely. That decision, to bypass the old gateway instead of endlessly fighting over it, became one of history's great turning points. It launched the age of exploration and set in motion the global economic system whose foundations still shape the modern world.
Watch the chain. Losing control of the land route forces a search for a sea route. The search for a sea route demands new navigational technology. New technology enables transatlantic voyages. Transatlantic voyages lead to the colonization of the Americas. Colonization builds transoceanic trade empires. Trade empires evolve into industrial shipping. Industrial shipping becomes the container ship. The container ship becomes the oil tanker and the global supply chain. The global supply chain becomes the fiber optic cable and the cloud server, routing information instead of cargo. Ancient caravan routes became Roman fleets. Roman fleets became Constantinople's customs house. Constantinople became Venice's banks. Venice became Portugal's ships. Portugal's ships became Atlantic trade.
Atlantic trade became industrial capitalism. Industrial capitalism became the interconnected, instantaneous global economy we live inside today. This is not 10 separate histories. It is one operating system, upgrading itself, generation after generation, always chasing the same prize: control of what moves. Here is what most people miss. The channel running through Istanbul never stopped mattering. It simply stopped being alone. Today, the same logic that built Constantinople governs a network of choke points spanning the entire planet. The Strait of Hormuz decides the price of oil for the world. The Strait of Malacca decides whether Asian manufacturing reaches global markets. The Suez Canal and the Panama Canal decide how quickly goods move between oceans. Bab el-Mandeb and the Strait of Gibraltar decide who controls access between seas. Singapore and Dubai have built entire economies on being the unavoidable stop between larger powers, exactly as Constantinople once did. The City of London still functions as a choke point for global finance, the same way Byzantine customs officers once functioned as a choke point for silk. Even the Bosphorus itself never disappeared from the story. Grain shipments feeding continents still pass through it. International treaties still regulate exactly which warships may cross it. The toll booth changed its uniform. It never closed. Return to the opening question. Why does the modern world still depend on a handful of narrow gaps you could throw a stone across? Because the world was never organized around who owns the most land or who produces the most goods. It has always been organized around who controls what moves, through straits, through banks, through cables, through devices, through the cloud. Constantinople didn't invent this rule. Look at a map of the modern world again, and you'll notice something that was always there. It isn't a map of countries. It's a map of gaps. And whoever controls the gap has always controlled the world flowing through it.